But at the end of the day, you took a 30-year sentence and turned it into about an extra maybe 13, 12 or 13 months. You basically boiled 30 down to one.
Well, we did, right? And it was not, and not just the professionals. My client had a lot to do with that too.
But I want people to understand. I want them to just marinate in those numbers for a second. Because for everybody who's out there saying, I could never get that kind of result in a case, I'm not going to, whatever, you can. You can if you do the work. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. Over 1 million Americans face sentencing every year, and it will be the most important day of their lives. But we don't fully understand the system, how broken it is, and what we can do to make it better. I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year criminal defense lawyer and a sentencing expert. My goal is to bring more awareness, more fairness, and more humanity to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. Hey everybody, Doug Passon coming to you from Studio 3553 in Scottsdale, Arizona. Helping us get set for sentencing today. Ooh, this is going to be a good one. I'm excited. It's Joel Meyers. Joel is a criminal defense lawyer. And not only that, he's a good old friend of mine. We went to law school together 1 million years ago at Washington University in St. Louis. So I've known him since the early 90s. And I'm also proud to say that he is a colleague of mine. Joel brought me into a very serious federal criminal drug trafficking case in New Mexico, which is where he is based in Albuquerque/Santa Fe. And my job in that case was to do a sentencing mitigation video and help craft the sentencing narrative. So this is really, I think, the second in a series that I've been doing, Joel, about fearless lawyering, cases where a lawyer has shot for the moon, gotten an extraordinary result. And it was a big ask on the judge, but a lot of chutzpah, as we like to say. But the point was, Joel knows what he's doing. Joel did his homework. Joel built the bonds of connection with his client. Joel uncovered the story, and Joel had the goods when he went into court to ask for what he asked for. And that's what we're going to be talking about today: fearless lawyering and how we get there. Welcome, Joel Meyers. It's so nice to see your face on my podcast.
Well, it's nice to be here, Doug. I wanted to say this, first time, long time.
Right? That's beautiful. And just a little backstory on me. The whole reason I do this podcast is to stick my thumb in the eye of my high school radio teacher. His name was Tom Scholler, and he told me I'd never be on the radio. And look at me now, man.
Still not on the radio. Yes, exactly.
But see, that's the beauty. Flash forward 30, 40 years, and any dummy with an internet connection can have his own show. And I'm living proof.
Not on the radio.
Right? Let's thank you. I can always count on old friends to humble me.
And I wanted to go back. Why can't I be a longtime friend? Why do I have to be an old friend? I kind of bristled when you first said that.
Well, I didn't mean age. I just meant old, as there's nothing better than old friends.
Longtime friends.
They knew you back. They knew you back when. All right, longtime friend, first time caller, longtime listener, Joel Meyers.
Exactly.
Welcome.
That's it. Thank you. That's the introduction I wanted. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you. You got it. Well, so let's dig in. We're going to keep this quite vague because it is a real life case example, but the details are consequential in the sense of the seriousness. And so let's just dig in. Give me the rundown of where you were in this case and what you were up against, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I seem to have been up against, all the federal government had to bring. The charges were as severe as they get. A-level drug offense with 924C on a career offender. So yeah,
so people, sorry to interrupt, but I like to keep it for people who may not be lawyers. 924C is a brutal sentencing enhancement when there's a gun involved, and there's mandatory minimums, and the term of imprisonment can shoot through the roof.
Well, sure. I'll simplify it again. With the drug offense itself, you had anywhere from 10 to life in prison. With
Yeah.
the added to the gun offense, a minimum of 5 years consecutive to that, all the way up to life. The
Mm-hmm.
drug offenses also could have been elevated based upon the 2 prior felony drug convictions that my client had. So he
Huh?
could have been facing life in prison through many, many different avenues. So that's what
Perfect.
I was facing. I mean, however, when I first was retained on the case, I think he made the biggest decision that, forced what I was going to do, or at least put me in the direction of where we were going to go. And he made it a decision to cooperate with the government.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't necessarily advocate for it in every case. And maybe looking back in this case, I may or may not have, but it was a decision that was made even before I was involved, before any lawyer was involved. So
Mm-hmm.
right then, I mean, I'm sure you've been in cases with cooperators, and they make decisions that have legacy type consequences on the case, and you can't unring that bell.
Right.
So
And
it ties your hands, and it forces you to represent them in a different manner. I mean, we had probably a real, Fourth Amendment issue in the case. There were some other cooperators that had led to the interaction with my client initially.
mm-hmm.
So there could have been a challenge, but when you're looking at that, right, you lose and it's all over. I mean, that would have been life in prison. But the
Yeah.
decision was made before me. So looking back on it, I don't think it was the wrong decision. And obviously, we'll get to the result. And I think the result speaks for itself, at least at this point.
Yeah. And right or wrong, I mean, we could have that debate another time, but the reality is, especially in a case with mandatory minimums, which is basically every drug trafficking case, cooperation happens quite a lot, more often than
Right.
not.
And with the
Because
gun involved, this was the only way to get outside the mandatory
yeah,
minimums. There was no other way.
yeah. And that is, so these mandatory minimums are what they say they are. They're mandatory, but there are a couple of little trap doors that that a judge could actually give the judge legal authority to go below the mandatory minimum. Cooperation is one.
And
So
in
that
this
makes
case, it was the
sense.
only one. It was the
Yeah.
only one in this case.
And but there's another dimension to cooperation too, which is, it's the utilitarian version, which is this is the only option I have to get possibly below a mandatory minimum. Is never a guarantee, and especially with facts like this, still iffy. But if you're really serious about it and you really want to make amends for what you're doing, then cooperation, if it's genuine, if it's substantial, is actually a really good way to help the judge understand that you are remorseful, that you are interested in changing your life, and that maybe you won't do this kind of thing again. Now
I
you
mean, look at
had,
it as the greatest demonstration of acceptance of your responsibility for your actions, of course.
yeah, right. And like you mentioned, the consequences that come along with that show just how just how much you're willing to accept responsibility, because it's literally like a dangerous proposition in many cases to cooperate against other
Sure, and
people.
cognitively, like what you've done, it's very hard to unwind that, right?
Yeah.
You've made that decision to join, they like to say, Team America.
And
And
speaking of Team America, might I just say one of your qualifications is, I mean, the other side of this full well because you lived it for what, 20 plus years. You were
21 years. I was a prosecutor for 21 years.
yes. And you have the dubious distinction of only being the second former AUSA that I've had on the podcast. But I am a firm believer that former prosecutors can be amazing defense lawyers. You're one of them. Not they're
Appreciate
not all. They're not
it.
all. And here's why I say that, because tell me if I'm wrong, but as a prosecutor, you're not really interested in getting to know anybody in your case in terms of having to tell their story. The case,
Absolutely.
right? And so
100%.
it's a skill set that's not easy. It's not necessarily intuitive, and you don't flex those muscles necessarily as a prosecutor. So here you are on the defense side, and I was absolutely astounded by the level of connection that you had established, not just with the client, but with his family. Like it was so obvious. And this is the first exposure I've had to you as a lawyer. I don't know why we never crossed paths. We're both in the federal system in states, neighboring states, but we never did. But this is the first experience I had with you in the professional context. And I just want to say I was totally blown away.
I'm
Um,
grateful. I'm grateful to say that. I was grateful to have these people come into my life, and I will. And you really, Doug, hit the nail on the head. I know this is not necessarily the topic of this podcast. One of the things I was thinking about was that, transition from prosecutor to defense attorney, and really some of the joys that I have about it. And you're meeting people on a whole new level,
yeah.
and everybody has their own origin story, right? Everyone has people who love them, or at some point, if people love them, had a mother and a father, and maybe they're not in their lives. And unfortunately, a lot of them they're not. But you meet these families, right? They bring you into the family. I think that's the best way to help them, to know what they want, to not leave them. I have, clients who continue to call me afterwards. I spoke to, our client's mother the other day, just out of nowhere, just checking in to see how they were doing, because they become part of your life. You're the most important person in their life. The bridge between, this terrible event, right,
Mm-hmm.
and what the future holds. And obviously, the biggest problem that everybody has in life, and particularly in the criminal justice system, is dealing with uncertainty, right? Not knowing what's going to happen.
Yep.
And to help people bridge that gap and to be there, and they come to rely on you, and you like them. And I've been very lucky. I'm lucky to have these people in my life now.
And they're lucky to have you. So when we're doing this, we're doing storytelling, and story and narrative is, as my mentor, my guru, my story guru, Randy Olson says, narrative is simply a series of events that occur in search of a solution to a problem. So what we're doing when we're doing storytelling is we're zeroing in on what are the big problems of the case and how do we tell a story around it. And you mentioned a lot of drug quantity is always a huge problem because it sends a guideline through the roof. Gun is always a huge problem. But you mentioned also something called career offender. He has 2 prior convictions for offenses that are in the realm of drug trafficking. So this is like the third time. And it wasn't a whole lot of time that passed before the prison sentence that he did for the last ones. And so to me, that could be the biggest problem, because what we're doing is trying to get a hold of the narrative, because the government's story is already written.
Sure.
Unrepentant, repeat offender, getting bigger, getting better, getting more dangerous, more sophisticated, never going to learn his lesson. We need to give them a sentence as long as possible to either teach them that lesson or at least put them out of commission for as long as possible so they can't do this. And the ranges, forget the mandatory minimums, we have the guidelines too. And the guidelines for this case were 30, upwards of almost 30 years at the minimum, 352
Exactly.
months to
Exactly.
425. So that's a massive hurdle. That's a massive hurdle to clear. And so give us a sense of how we can build the narrative around that big problem.
So it really begs the question, how did we get here, right? Like that's what has to be answered right away. And that was the key to this case. Or at least when you came into the case, that's when we realized what it was. It was this, untreated drug addiction that brought him here, as well as, a certain charm and not necessarily skill in drug trafficking, just like in people skills and development. But how did somebody not learn their lesson after having 2 prior convictions, having been to state prison, and like you said, get bigger and bigger? We have to be able to tell that story. The
Mhm.
government story is already told, as you said, because
Yeah,
they had to be a better drug dealer.
right.
That's
And
not the story that we wanted to tell.
And for those of you who follow my rap on the 3 R's of sentencing storytelling, you're talking about the revelation stories, where we're revealing the deeper levels of truth behind how a person arrives at this moment in time. And for this particular client, when you started digging into, well, unrepentant repeat offender, okay, it was always a drug addiction at the core of this. This was never about making money selling drugs. It was about feeding a habit, and it grew and grew and grew out of
And that
control
just
from
happened.
there.
And then it was making a lot of money and selling a lot of drugs as a result. So one of the first things I did to try to get a handle on, even before I hired you, was that I hired a psychologist who I work with often
Yeah.
to have a psychological evaluation done. It's kind of in advance of this notion of sentencing mitigation. How do we get here? How do we even tell this story? What does that look like? And I've used her on multiple cases. And I also kind of tell my clients, kind of like a gift. Like, wouldn't you love a 30-page paper that kind of unpacks Doug Passon, what makes Doug make the decisions he makes? I mean, it might be a little scary, but
Terrifying.
it's like you know, a roadmap of your life and your decision making process. And I think it's a wonderful gift. And that was very helpful for me, but more importantly, helpful for my client. I'm sure it was helpful for you as we started crafting what our narrative is going to be leading up to sentencing.
Yep. Yeah.
Because that's what this case was from the beginning. I
It
mean,
was a sentencing case. Yeah.
within 4 days of his arrest, we'd already pleaded.
Right. And that is every case really is a sentencing case, because 99% of these cases end up at sentencing. So and you got a very detailed psych eval, which is great. A lot of folks wouldn't go. They'd say, look, this is just quite simple. It's the government story. Selling drugs, making money. Like, what do you need a psychologist to tell us about, that for? And the truth is you do. And you need more than just a psychologist. So you're basically building a great team of experts here.
I mean, that's what
Myself
it was. And
included.
I was grateful. You want our talk, at least to our strategy, to have more mass appeal, right? We were lucky in our case that we had resources. There were family resources that
Yeah.
allowed us to hire the necessary people. But I don't just do this in cases where I have the family resources to do it. If I'm appointed in cases, you can seek out these resources through CJ. Haven't quite gone so far as to get a sentencing video from you, but I will. I'm telling you, I will get one through CJ. But I bring the psychologist in, I bring sentencing other experts and other people whom we've worked with in the past. In fact, I've been brought in on a case where there was private counsel. I was brought in as a secondary CJ lawyer. So the funds are available to do that. You just have to ask. And I think that's part of what we're
Interesting.
saying. We just need to lean in sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And not be afraid to. I think just a lot of lawyers are kind of timid, and they say, I don't think the judge is going to like that. I don't want to annoy the judge. I don't want to burn any bridges for the next case or the next client. But I believe in my heart of hearts that if you just do it off the cuff, that's a real concern. If you can't back up what you're saying, then yeah, don't do it. But if you've done the homework, most judges are going to be fully on board because
And it is doing the
you made
homework,
your case.
explaining why. The biggest thing, obviously, anytime I think you go into court or here in public, is authenticity.
Yep.
And if you can demonstrate that to the judge, ultimately, it's what we're working towards the end, for our advocacy, but also to coach our clients too, because, we can say what we want, but a lot of it has to come from the client too. And I think it's coaching them and educating them and bringing out the parts
Yep.
of them that
Yep.
they can be more introspective.
And I believe that every case there's a good story to tell if you just dig enough and peel back the layers just enough. But in this case, it was a phenomenal story. So he gets arrested and he goes to prison for a few years, I think, maybe 3 or 4, and a couple of lower level trafficking things. And before he even leaves prison, he is totally committed to turning his life around. And again, he was in there because he had an addiction, not because he was really hell bent on being a drug dealer. And so he took all these amazing steps before he even got released from prison to redeem himself. So that's our redemption story. And when he got out, he wasn't just getting through, he was a superstar. He was back in college as a straight A student. He was doing all this amazing community work with local organizations for, you know, offenders who are reentering society, so much so that they asked him to be on the board of their organization. Like this guy was so clearly 1,000% committed to never ever repeating this behavior again.
I mean,
And
there's more. He was involved in the life of his daughter.
yeah,
He
reunited with his daughter. Yeah, the
was
kid.
working on his own physical fitness and excelling in that. And then he went and he met somebody we decided to marry.
Right.
Everything was an upward trajectory.
Yep. And he had
It
work
could have
in
been a
construction.
situation where it was too much too fast.
Right. And then COVID hits.
And then COVID hits.
So his
And
main network of support, which is all of the AA and the great organizations, these are his lifeline, his tether to sobriety and to community. And they're virtually severed overnight with COVID. Um, and he's finding himself a new dad with a new kid in a new marriage with financial troubles and the whole bit. And
and honestly, without that support system, I think it's probably like, we've spoke about it. I think it's called 13 step, right? It's when you think that you're bigger than all the ones before that. And that's when you mess up.
mm,
And, you know, I've never personally dealt with addiction or anything, but having seen so many clients who have that, they can't let up, not for a day. And
and that's a big,
when you think you're strong enough to beat it, is when it's got its hold on you again.
and this is why we tell these stories, because a lot of us don't have firsthand experience with the truth of addiction. And we would
Sure.
like to just prejudge it and say, well, there's
Why
some
can't you just
weakness.
stop, right?
Right. And so this is about then helping them to kind of see the world through our clients' eyes or through addiction's eyes. And the truth is, that first relapse comes and he's so filled with shame that he can't at that point reach out. You would think it'd be easy to just say, okay, well, somehow I got to get some help, even though it's COVID and I could do a Zoom meeting or something else. But he was so connected and so kind of revered. He was mentoring other people. He was a role model at this point. And
Right?
he was
But
so filled with shame that he had let himself down and let everyone else down that he
and was a
couldn't reach
hypocrite.
out and was a hypocrite. So now he's further isolated by his own shame. And this is a spiral. This is just a downward spiral. And you starting to get even more disconnected. And then he goes down the road of selling. And here we are.
Yeah.
So it's a
And
pretty
selling
powerful,
more and more and more.
right?
And, to your point earlier, having been on the other side, I can understand the difficulty in, kind of a prosecution mentality and see that, like, the notion of what it is selling to you is, well, I'll buy 2 grams and sell 1 gram and that's going to pay for it. But that's kind of what this notion is. But that's not what our case was. Our case involved, dozens and dozens of kilos and hundreds of thousands of dollars done. And yet we still want to portray this as, selling in order to feed a habit. And there's dissonance between it. It's very, very hard. I suffered from it too, having kind of, 21 years of kind of the government view of things. So it's very hard. Like, I knew that was going to be a challenge. How do we convey to our ultimate audience, which is going to be the judge, right, that can understand the person who is like living under, a bridge, selling small amounts, using and doing that. But that's not who our client was. Our client had hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash and kilos of drugs. How
Which
do we?
interestingly wasn't spending the
No,
money.
yeah.
What
I mean,
what
I
was
had
the
my own
story
thought
behind
that
that?
I just had my own thought that this represented achievement. And as bizarre as it seems, and I know, I mean, he's succeeded in the past, right? And I know he'll succeed again in the future. He just happened to choose an, horrible industry with which to, ply his wares. But to me, you've got all the things you're talking about, the existential pressures that he's feeling, economic pressures, the school pressures, the family pressures. But what do I have here? I have this bounty, and this is demonstrates like my worth, my skill, my achievements. I think it's a perverse way to look at it, but that was my view of what that was, because they had a broken dishwasher at home, but hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash.
Yeah.
Um,
He's not driving
Another
flashy
difficult thing
cars.
to
He's
be
not.
able to convey.
Yeah. It's so
Who is this
interesting.
person? So it was actually good. He wasn't riding around in flashy cars or spending a lot and making drawing a lot of attention to himself. So I think that was actually something that supported our narrative,
Yeah.
that it didn't mean anything to him. It didn't mean like the economic buying power of the money. To me, it was the trophy. Like, you've done good here and you made more money here. This was
Well, and
the
it was a testament to how um I don't want to say charismatic, but just deeply functional and smart and like he was whatever he was going to do, he was going to be a success. He was going to be successful because he was motivated and he was smart and he was connected to people. And I think what happens is he starts connecting to these wrong people because he's using again, and they see
that's a
those qualities in him and they take advantage of those
That's a
qualities.
pretty common story, Doug, and I witnessed that a lot, both, now as a defense attorney and also as a prosecutor. I mean, as you got into some of the, higher level drug traffickers in, like, say their prime, kind of like late 20s to late 30s, like very charismatic people who, probably would be enjoyable to have a beer with, but you might not want them dating your sister.
Yeah.
Um, so it's just an example of their ability, right?
Yeah.
Uh, Survival skills, if you will. Their life is different. How did you get here? Why are you not, working in corporate America? Why are you not even being a car salesman? You obviously have the ability to do these things and it's charming and people believe you. Um,
What made you think about doing a video in this case?
um, that's a good question. Um, we had the resources. That was kind of the first thing. Now, how can we tell the stories? I think I struggled. I
Yeah.
struggled with the ability to tell the story that I was envisioning that was unfolding. And I don't think it was watching The Simpsons that made me think of you again, but it just seemed to line up. At the beginning of a case, like you said, most cases are sentencing cases. I'm really good at triaging a case. I can see it. I know where the mitigation points are going to be.
Hmm.
But I was just thinking the beginning of the case, which was some 2 years prior to even sentencing. How am I going to write the sentencing memorandum? How am I going to verbally advocate on behalf of my client? I think I'm fairly good at those two things, but I also knew that I don't think I'd be able to do it just with those two skills alone,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I wanted the visual component to it, and whether it was through my own inability or not, there was no way that I was going to be able to write something and submit it to the court
Yeah.
or advocate on behalf of my client actually at sentencing that would have been as vivid and be able to bring that story, nor would my client be able to kind of carry that water, so to speak, either.
Right.
And I just I thought of you, of course.
Well, I'm glad
I
you
did
did.
because I'm glad I did because to me that was the difference. And I'll tell you, you know, the way I knew that it was the difference. And we had to submit this video in advance of sentencing. She wanted it a month or 2 months in advance, whatever it was. And I love the video. When I got it, I showed it to anybody and everybody. And we were just talking, just talking to my daughter earlier, and she kind of
A
forgets.
fledgling filmmaker in
Yeah,
her own
she
right.
forgets that she was in tears watching this video, but she was bawling, Doug. And I would choke up every time, but I was sending out to people, give me some feedback. I don't want to hear compliments all the time. What is the deficiency? What is someone going to look at this and just
Yeah.
sneer at it? And we had to send it to the prosecutor earlier. We had to send it to probation earlier. Prosecution, they weren't, saying, "Oh, this is an Oscar-winning short here," but I didn't get a lot of pushback from them.
Yeah.
Probation immediately came back and a comment. These are people, colleagues of mine and friends. Loved it. But the biggest thing beyond all that, and I know the judge would watch it because we submitted it, it was at sentencing when I had no plans to play it. As much as I loved it, as much as I wanted to see, I loved watching people's reactions. I would watch it with them because I loved their reactions. Also helped us in the editing process of it too, where we saw what resonated, what didn't. But once we had that final product, I loved
Yeah.
just seeing people. I was proud of it. I was proud of what we put together. I was proud of the story it told. I was proud of my client.
Yeah.
But then the judge asked me to play it at sentencing.
Which I'm trying to think if that's ever happened. I've done so many of these. Most of the time we submit them in advance. Sometimes the judge holds them back to play in the court, but I can't remember a time where it was submitted in advance and the judge says, let's play it again in court. Why do you think she did that?
For the same reasons that I wanted to show it to everybody. I mean, she's a incredibly, conscientious and
Yeah.
thoughtful and engaged judge. I mean, without question. But still could have been all that without then showing. Everybody in that courtroom had already seen this video at least once, perhaps, many, many more times.
Yeah.
But there's something about watching the reactions of the others as they're seeing it. I think it was important that it was played in front of my client who's standing up there next to me at the podium while this is being played. The judge is able to observe, him on the screen and all the other people, him standing next to me, how he is responding to it. We're able to observe how the judge is responding, how the prosecution, how probation, the few people in the audience who were there. And it was at that point where I knew how valuable that was. It was funny. I was talking to one of my friends the other day. We were coming back from skiing, and he asked me if I thought that the video was effective. I said, I think it was the biggest thing that we did. And I brought up that story again. Why would she want to play it? We've all seen it. It's not going to be in the record other than the transcript video
Yeah.
played, right?
Yeah. 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 And I do feel like, we can't always accomplish this in every case, but this was fundamentally a hopeful story that he was giving it his all. He did fall majorly, but that he will be back. He'll be okay, and he'll be an inspiration to others who are falling down in the same way that he fell down. And I'm thinking maybe this little hope, this inspiration element might have been why the judge wants, to kind of project that in court, because fundamentally I think that's what everybody wants. I mean,
Well, I'll tell you
well, not
this.
necessarily the prosecution. We'll get there in a second, but
I'll tell you
sorry, what were
this,
you going to
though.
say?
It was hopeful and inspirational to me, and I think it energized me in the case. It helped my advocacy. Going with you, Doug, and watching you interview these people, even though, we trimmed it down like the hour interview to maybe 3 minutes, I still recall all of that. It brought me closer to the family, closer to the story, um, helped me communicate with my client and able to explain to him there's so many people that are in your life that are there for you, just didn't know. And watching it with him the first time, I remember that sitting
Yeah.
in a jail cell. We were literally in a jail cell together, and um, watching him hear the other people that were talking
Saying you
about,
got this, saying we got you, you got this, you're gonna be okay. Keep
and
trying.
then also we were there for you, right?
Yeah, we're gonna be
And
here.
never
Yeah.
left. And hopefully that gives him enough strength, because I imagine he'll fall again, right? I mean, relapse is part of recovery,
Yeah.
and he has a long road ahead of him for sure. But hopefully he knows that he has this tremendous foundation. But not
Right. And
everybody
our
has that. This was a perfect storm, Doug. Not everybody has that.
and fundamentally our so-called correctional system um exacerbates trauma and the things that cause relapse. So there isn't going to be a whole lot of therapeutic interventions for him until he gets out of custody, is my guess. But that's
Sure.
probably another podcast too. But I would like to talk about the government. And I get that they do what they do. In all their gracious wisdom, remember the guidelines are like 352 to something. They're asking for 130 months at sentencing, right?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
So that
after, what I believe was, a very generous 5K motion.
Well, if you look at it from
Which
the
again, it's
starting
tied
point
to the
of
guidelines, right?
yeah, if
So
you look at it from the starting point of 352, then yeah, 130 months could be construed as generous. But the truth is that's over 10 years into a guy who's given cooperation and now he's in custody. Um, and we don't have to guess because the 2 years he had already been in custody was a nightmare. And the government knows that every day that he spends in custody is going to be exponentially worse than somebody who didn't bend over backwards to help them. And
I don't even know that they know that. You'd think that they would, and I say again, coming from, previous life, whether you know it or not, it's not really a thought, unfortunately.
you got to put it
Um,
out of their head. It is what it is. Okay.
and I think there's kind of a Pollyanna type of view about the Bureau of Prisons, their ability to do things, their ability to safeguard people, what it's really like in custody.
Yeah.
Because they're not exposed to it. It's not even through ill will. I mean, I've had no issue with the prosecutor in this case. I think he was earnest. He meant well. He has a job. He has a client that he's representing. They can't do it in the same way that we do, right? We have an individual client who's got a family.
Right.
It impacts them. It's the most important thing in their life. Their client is 350 million people, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I get that. I understand. And so we haven't talked about what the outcome was. So we started mandatory minimums and guidelines of almost 30 years. We moved to government asking for about 11 years. Where do we end up?
And I actually, pivoted, from my original ask. I think I originally asked for maybe like 5 years or something. I think I might have asked for 5 years, and I felt duty bound to continue that. But then, in addition to what we were doing, we were also looking into residential treatment facilities,
Yeah.
whether it's going to be part of supervised release, whether it would be part of probation, whether it would be in lieu of jail, which would have been wonderful. Um, and I kind of made the decision the day of sentencing to even ask for less time. And normally I kind of view my word as my bond, particularly with this court, which I believe I have a very good relationship with. And um, I asked for less time. I think, we ended up with 41 months. Um, of which afterwards there would be a participation in a treatment program
Hmm.
as part of supervised release. And there's just, and like the best part was that I had appealed to detention prior to sentencing, which was going to get taken up at sentencing.
Hmm.
And for a
This was,
number
by the way, the ultimate chutzpah, this ask right now. I have never, ever heard of this happening, or if I've heard of it being asked, I've never heard of it being granted. But tell me what you did.
um, as we're like careening towards sentencing, his custodial situation was tragic. It was difficult, right? I was very, very concerned about his safety, both currently and in the future. We also, in addition to you, we brought in, our dear friends and sentencing experts who helped us tremendously.
Shout out to Maureen Baird. We've had her on the podcast and mentioned her many, many other times, but she's a Bureau of Prisons consultant.
and
Amazing.
Maureen and Walt were amazing. And it
Well,
was like, how is somebody going to serve their time is important too. So we knew there'd be a time component. Where are they going to serve? It was more than just that. It was classification. And one of the interesting things was he was a few points away from scoring minimal as opposed to low or even medium. We could have captured those points with voluntary surrender. Unfortunately, the government took that away from us early on in the case. So that was, one reason that if we were able to get him released and then voluntary surrender, he would get the 3-point reduction in the Bureau of Prison classification, which would have put him in what we believe would be a safer environment. In addition to that, it would allow, I think, a little bit more careful reflection by the Bureau of Prisons to come up with a good designation and then allow him to, get his affairs in order. And a lot of people want to do that. I mean, sometimes I discourage people because much as it's nice to get out, it makes it very hard to go back in. And
yeah,
we went with eyes open on this, but to me, the most important thing was that voluntary surrender component and the proper classification outweighed everything.
so
So
let's everybody just wrap our heads around this. He's been in pre-trial custody in these horrible county jail facilities or wherever they hold pre-trial federal detainees. It depends on the jurisdiction for like almost 2 years.
right.
And then you're going into sentencing and saying, okay, now he's convicted and sentenced to a term of 41 months or whatever, but we would like you to send him home today too, Judge,
Yeah.
so that he can go be with his family, go settle up his affairs, and mess with his classification system. You're playing chess with this, not checkers, because that most lawyers don't even know there is a classification system, let alone how a self-surrender is going to take points off of that and impact their placement. And a lower custody placement means a hopefully safer, less punitive time of custody. So you've got all this stuff, and you're literally saying, yeah, okay, so I get it. He's got to serve a sentence, but send him home today. And that never fucking happens, ever.
Well,
Have you ever heard of that happening?
I
Maybe in
did
New
because
Mexico.
I was there. It
Well,
happened.
I mean,
Um,
but have you ever heard of it happening outside of this case? Because I have not.
no,
If I
no.
have, I can't remember, especially not in a case like this.
But the equity's kind of lined up for it, honestly. And um, it's really, the terrible thing with cooperation. And there's a lot of, ways that it comes out or it's noticed or you're just treated differently.
Yeah,
I mean, he'd been assaulted several times while in custody.
yeah,
No one beats you up and says, "We know you're a snitch," and then kicks your ass and stomps you out. But that's what happens,
right.
and you have to be vigilant every single day because your paperwork is different. And that's a
Mm-hmm.
problem that we face now. We were talking about before the show started. There's no full way to backstop it. And I dealt with that before as a government attorney, and I ran the drug section where we dealt
Yeah.
with all the cooperators.
And just to add a little background, so when you go into custody, there's a culture and people want to know what you're in for. And if you have a particular offense, like a sex offense or whatever, you're going to be treated differently. So they really do put a lot of pressure on you to show your papers and
Sure.
prove what you're in there for and that you're somehow worthy of being in this population.
And
If
even
you
though
don't,
everybody says, the PSR is contraband, you can't bring it with you, you can't bring it with you. If you don't have it, there's going to be, they're going to think the worst.
mm-hmm,
You have to have it. Whether it's
yeah,
allowed there or not, it is there. I received a call from a client the other day. He asked me for his PSR. He knows I can't send it. So, but he needs it. And that's a very troubling thing. People check Pacer. They have Pacer accounts. It only costs what, 10 cents a page? It's not, you want to find out about somebody, you've
not
got
that hard.
a lot of time to do it. It's not that hard and not that expensive. So it's very challenging in order to, like you said, it's almost like three-dimensional chess, right? Where, things are
Mm-hmm.
falling at different rates and you're moving pieces on a board. Like, okay, the biggest problem we have, which is a great problem, how do you explain such a wonderful sentence in such a serious case?
Right.
And you can't. You just got to own it. And with that comes
We
danger.
should
And
just get
some
him a
danger.
copy of the sentencing video to show everybody, and
Oh
that'll
yeah, just a little kumbaya session in the TV room. I don't know if
right.
that's going to happen, even in some of these low
But
facilities.
I'll tell you what, this ask about please release me is also really the next chapter in his redemption story, because you're telling the judge, first of all, the judge had to believe that what you were saying was sincere about his willing, his commitment to sobriety and to living a lawful existence.
And it's a way
Because
to demonstrate it too.
she never would have let him out if she thought for a minute he was going to skip town or not show up to self-surrender to his sentence or do anything dangerous or bad or violent or anything else. So
But he had
that's
to
a
earn it too, right? He was still subject to the typical conditions of what would be pretrial supervision. Normally it wasn't. It was
yeah.
kind of pre-sentence supervision.
Well,
But that's an ask that's important for that, voluntary surrender at sentence. Sometimes you have people that are out that, they're going to go in. It's so, so important. And it can't just be for, later in the day. It has to be meaningful. You
yeah.
can't just order to be self-surrendered that day, but it's important. And I think it helps with classification. People helps people with their life. And when we talked about it, as difficult it is to go back in and people have trouble in like the vague part of their life and uncertainty.
And I don't want to beat a dead horse, but on the topic of fearless lawyering, it's a huge ask. And most lawyers, almost every lawyer would say, there's no way in hell the judge is going to grant that. I'm going to look stupid for even asking. I'm not doing that.
Well, I guess I didn't
And
have that reflection. Like I just,
well,
we talked about
that's
authenticity, Doug. That's what I'm going to do. I once
yes.
said I'm
And
going to ask for it.
exactly. And there's another element here, which I hate to say is true, but there is a sort of a lottery aspect to this system of ours, which is to say, if you would have not gotten this particular judge who might be more open and more compassionate and more understanding, and you would have been in front of a different judge, then you might have been sort of waved off on
Right, but I
this.
don't think it should change the ask, and I don't think it should change like how we leaned in and how we did it. Would not have handled this case any differently in front of any different judge. I mean, we
Right.
had a receptive audience. Was it a result of the judge? Was it a result of the product we put together? And I say product, I mean, that's what we did. We really, this was thinking about it. We put a lot of different focus on this case, from mental health to mitigation, to the retribution story,
Yeah.
rehabilitation story, to the
Yeah.
family component. There were a lot of us involved.
Yeah, I agree 1,000%. And in fact, those judges who you may be least likely to have the success with are the ones that need to hear these arguments the most. So we need to make them no matter what. And I will just build out on the 3 R's. The redemption element of this was the overwhelmingly most powerful aspect, I think. And when I teach lawyers about redemption stories, I make sure that they understand they can be past, present, and future. And you had all three here, which is his past redemption with all the great things he did when he got out the first time that proved he was serious about his own rehabilitation. And his present redemption was the cooperation. And future, people ignore this. This one is the one that kind of gets lost, but you have to, it's not enough to just say, he'll be great. You know, he's really committed this time, Judge. If you haven't done the work to sort of build out what the future looks like. And in this case, and I know that your client was very active in this too, but you found a program, an inpatient residential program out of state that was going to be perfect for him. And you presented this whole thing like this is what the future holds. And you use that as further way to say, give him less time in jail because we want him a year or two or however long it's going to take in residential treatment, which he's never had and really, really needs, and so committed to getting through. And without that program that you built out there, you're leaving an open question to the judge.
And
And
add to that a little bit, I guess we're talking about, and then the release component prior to sentencing is, I mean, the judge doesn't have a crystal ball, but you have this, body of work at least that we can show, like, hey, he's out now, he's doing what he's supposed to be doing. Like, I think it gives some faith going forward, and that's what we needed, because I think when you're on strike number 3, you've probably burned through some of your lives before that.
Yep. And so I just want to kind of put a finer point on the time, the sentence that was imposed, because if it was 40 some months, he's already served almost 2 years, and there's good time credit and there's this and there's that. So at the end of the day, you took a 30-year sentence and turned it into about an extra maybe 12 or 13 months. You basically boiled 30 down to 1.
Well, we did, right? And it was not, and not just the professionals. My client had a lot to do with that too.
But I want people to understand. I want them to just marinate in those numbers for a second, because for everybody who's out there saying I could never get that kind of result in a case, I'm not going to. Whatever you can if you do the work. So put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Totally.
Or maybe
and I'm
not.
grateful that I was able to kind of think big and bring a great group together.
Yeah, team approach is everything. I mean, a lawyer's not supposed to know everything about everything. They're only supposed to know when they don't know and need the help. And you bring in prison experts, you're bringing in psychological experts, you're bringing in, family members, you're bringing in historical evidence, you're bringing in records, you're bringing in filmmakers,
and
whatever it is.
Just enough about those little components to be able to weave this, summary of it. I mean, it's like when you deal with experts, you got an expert in a trial, you're coming up, you learn everything about that. You're never going to be smarter than the expert, even these quack experts. You got a PhD from somewhere, but you need to know that for the hour or 2-hour period. You need to know well, or know what you don't know. And I knew there were a lot of things that I didn't know and how I was going to weave all this together. So I learned about kind of that psychological component. I learned about the prison system. I learned about the whole narrative and storytelling. That's where it all began, Doug. I mean, this was really somehow, even before you were involved, I was thinking that I needed you, I guess.
Well, and it's kind of interesting because you've been in this arena as a prosecutor forever. And what does that tell you? That defense lawyers weren't making these arguments. They weren't bringing these experts into bear. Otherwise,
or they were against a really good prosecutor. Maybe, I don't know.
But like a lot of lawyers just don't do it, and we don't need to do this in every case. I mean, some of the cases the stakes are super low and the result is kind of preordained. But in a case like this, it's his life on the line.
Totally.
And you've got to bring out every resource to bear. And so now hopefully
I mean, it's not just his life, like life outside the walls of a prison. It was truly his life. I mean, at the core, this was an addiction that, if left untreated, would kill him, right? Yeah. And so to handle everything was totally his life, and it will continue to be beyond, when we're all gone.
Well, I'm super excited to kind of follow this client story when he does get out, which will be very soon, and does go through rehab and hopefully goes on to do great things. And you're right, he may relapse. That is part of recovery, but I feel like if anyone's got a shot at having a great life, this guy does. And you gave that to him. So, first of all, I appreciate your fearless lawyering for just coming on the podcast and
Yeah, well, I'm
talking
glad.
to me.
I'm sorry that it took me so long. You can thank
But
Maureen. Maureen
yeah,
is
I know. I
listening
told Maureen because apparently she talks to you now more than me. Thank you very
every
much. And I
day.
told her she's better lean on you. And then I got a call the same day. So
Immediately.
okay, well, we got it done. And this is going to be a monumental episode because it's 50. It's episode 50. That's some kind of milestone. Or I guess maybe 52 would be the milestone because that's a full year. But I didn't want to be the guy that
And that would be
started
our age too.
for another month. Yeah, that's exactly right. For me,
I'm not
anyway.
there yet, but I know.
But I
Because
didn't want to be
we're old friends, I guess, huh?
we are old lifelong friends and colleagues, and I hope we get a chance to hang out soon in person.
We will.
And until then, thank you so much.
Oh,
And
you
if
bet.
anybody needs, I hope nobody needs Joel Meyers services. But if you do, especially if you're in New Mexico, I'm going to put all his contact info in the show notes. But he's one of the good ones. So thank you.
Thank you, Doug. I mean, you're the best. I learned so much from you. I really did. Not so much in the podcast, but no, I'm kidding. No,
That's it for today. But before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today, getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassonlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off on a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.